When I discovered that my husband of 40 years and my cousin had been carrying on behind my back for 2 decades, my first reaction wasn't rage or heartbreak. It was relief. Pure, overwhelming relief that I wasn't losing my mind after all. That every instinct I'd buried, every suspicion I'd talked myself out of, every moment I'd felt crazy for questioning what I saw with my own eyes, all of it had been real. I was 66 years old, and for the first time in 20 years, I felt like I could finally breathe. My name is Vera Sutherland, and I'm 68 years old now as I tell you this story. I live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where I was born and raised, where I taught second grade for 35 years, where I raised my 2 daughters, and where I thought I'd spend the rest of my life in the comfortable routine of a long marriage. I thought I knew my life. I thought I knew my husband. I thought I knew my family. I was wrong about all of it. But here's the thing about discovering a betrayal that's been going on for 20 years. By the time you find out, you've already survived it. You've already lived through 2 decades of it without the truth destroying you. The revelation doesn't break you. It explains you. It explains why you felt disconnected, why certain things never quite added up, why you sometimes felt like a stranger in your own life. The truth doesn't shatter your world. It clarifies a world that was already cracked and distorted, and you just couldn't see the pattern until someone finally turned on the lights. I found the documents on a Tuesday afternoon in September 2023. It was one of those perfect early fall days in Iowa when the humidity finally breaks and you can feel autumn creeping in around the edges. The leaves on the oak tree in our backyard were just starting to turn gold at the tips. I remember because I'd been standing in the kitchen looking out at that tree, drinking my coffee, thinking about how many autumns I'd watched from that same window. 42 autumns in that house, 40 years of marriage. A lifetime of seasons changing while I stood in the same spot, watching through the same glass. I'd gone up to the attic looking for my mother's old quilt. My daughter Rebecca was redecorating her guest room and had asked if she could have it. The attic was hot and dusty, even in September, and I was sweating by the time I'd moved enough boxes to reach the old cedar chest, where I knew the quilt was stored. That's when I saw it. A banker's box I didn't recognize, tucked behind the Christmas decorations, labeled in Martin's handwriting. Tax documents, 2003-2015. Now, before you read too much into this story and start feeling sorry for me, let me tell you what this moment felt like. It wasn't like in the movies where the woman's hands shake and her heart races and she's overcome with dread. I felt curious, detached, almost clinical. Because somewhere deep in my bones, I already knew. My body knew before my brain caught up. My hands were steady as I pulled that box toward me. My heart rate didn't spike. I just opened it like I was opening any ordinary box on any ordinary day. Inside were folders, neat, organized folders with labels in Martin's careful printing, property records, bank statements from accounts I'd never heard of, receipts for purchases I knew nothing about, and photographs. Lord help me. There were photographs, not the kind you're thinking, nothing crude or explicit, worse in a way. Pictures of Martin and Diane at places I'd never been, doing things I'd never done with him. Diane wearing jewelry I'd never seen. Martin's arm around her waist in front of a cabin I didn't know we owned. Both of them laughing in a way that looked so natural, so comfortable, so much like a couple who'd been together for years, because they had been. For 20 years. 20 years of my life, half of my marriage, an entire lifetime of deception happening right under my nose, involving 2 of the people I trusted most in the world. Before I dive deeper into what those documents revealed and how I handled what came next, I need you to understand something. If you're watching this, if you've made it this far in my story, then you're probably the kind of person who appreciates honesty and real human connection. This channel exists because of viewers like you who want to hear genuine stories about real people facing real problems. And I'm sharing mine because maybe, just maybe, it'll help someone else who's been questioning their own instincts, who's been told they're paranoid or imagining things, who needs to hear that trusting your gut isn't crazy, it's survival. So here's what I'm asking. If you find value in this story, if you want to be part of a community where we share these experiences and support each other, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell so you don't miss any of our stories. It takes 1 second to like this video, but that simple click helps us reach more people who need to hear these messages. Drop a comment telling me what you think so far, or let me know what city or country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel and connecting with all of you. Your support is what makes this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing these important stories. Every subscription, every like, every comment tells YouTube that real stories matter, and that helps us reach even more people who need to hear them. Thank you for being here, and now let me tell you how I got to that attic, to that box, to that moment when everything I thought I knew came crashing down around me. I was born Vera Jean Morrison in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in 1957. My parents, Donald and Margaret Morrison, were working-class people who believed in hard work, church on Sundays, and the importance of family above all else. My father worked at the Quaker Oats plant for 40 years, and my mother was a seamstress who took in alterations and made wedding dresses from our dining room table. We lived in a modest 3-bedroom house on the southwest side of Cedar Rapids, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, where you could borrow sugar from your neighbor, and where kids played in the street until the streetlights came on. I had one older brother, Tommy, who was 4 years my senior, and who died in a car accident when I was 16. His death shaped our family in ways that took me decades to understand. My mother became more protective, more anxious. My father became quieter, more withdrawn, and I became the good daughter, the one who never caused trouble, the one who made up for the son they'd lost by being as perfect and uncomplicated as possible. I learned early that keeping the peace was more important than rocking the boat. I learned to swallow my concerns, to rationalize away my doubts, to give people the benefit of the doubt, even when that doubt was screaming in my gut. This would serve me poorly later in life. I met Martin Sutherland when I was 23 years old, fresh out of the University of Northern Iowa with my teaching degree. He was 26, working as an accountant at a local firm, and we met at a church potluck in 1980. He was handsome in an unassuming way, average height, sandy brown hair that was already starting to thin a bit, wire-rimmed glasses that gave him a scholarly look. He was quiet, responsible, stable. After the chaos and grief of losing my brother, after watching my parents struggle through that loss, stability was exactly what I was looking for. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. Looking back now, I can see that even then, Martin was someone who took his time with everything, who never rushed, who always had a plan. He proposed in 1983, on my 26th birthday, at the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture. Martin wasn't that type. He presented me with a small velvet box over dessert. The ring nestled inside a modest but pretty solitaire diamond. He said he'd been saving for 2 years to buy it. I said yes because it made sense, because he was reliable, because my parents approved, because I was 26 and all my friends were getting married, and because I genuinely cared for him, even if the passion wasn't the kind you read about in romance novels. We married in October of 1983 at Sacred Heart Catholic Church, the same church where I'd been baptized, where I'd made my first communion, where my brother's funeral had been held. My cousin Diane was one of my bridesmaids. She was 3 years younger than me, 20 years old at the time, studying nursing at Kirkwood Community College. Diane's mother and my mother were sisters, and Diane and I had grown up as close as sisters ourselves. Her family lived just 6 blocks away from ours growing up, and she'd spent countless nights at our house, countless summers swimming at the public pool together, countless Christmases, opening presents, side by side under my grandmother's tree. Diane was beautiful in a way I never was. She had thick, dark hair that fell in natural waves, Clear skin, bright blue eyes, and that effortless way of moving through the world that turned heads without her even trying. I was plain by comparison, light brown hair that never quite did what I wanted it to, hazel eyes that were neither green nor brown, an average build, an average face, average everything. But I'd never been jealous of Diane. She was family. She was practically my sister. And when Martin and I got married, when Diane stood up there in her rose-colored bridesmaid dress and smiled at us during our vows, I never once imagined that 20 years later she'd be standing somewhere else entirely, wrapped in my husband's arms. Martin and I bought our house in 1984, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the northeast side of Cedar Rapids. It needed work, but it was ours. We painted the walls together, refinished the hardwood floors ourselves, planted roses in the front yard. Our first daughter, Rebecca, was born in 1985, arriving 2 weeks early on a snowy February morning. I remember Martin pacing the hospital waiting room, so nervous he could barely sit still. When the nurse finally brought Rebecca out and placed her in his arms, I saw his eyes fill with tears. Whatever reservations I might have had about the passionate dimension of our marriage vanished in that moment. This was a good man. This was a man who would be a good father. Our second daughter, Sarah, came 3 years later in 1988. With 2 little ones, I cut back my teaching hours to part-time, working only mornings so I could be home when the girls got out of school. Martin's accounting career was advancing steadily. He made partner at his firm in 1995, which meant longer hours and more travel, but also more money, more security. We could afford dance lessons for the girls, family vacations to the Wisconsin Dells, a newer car. We were living the American dream, or at least the Iowa version of it. Diane was a constant presence in our lives during those years. After she graduated from nursing school, she got a job at St. Luke's Hospital and rented an apartment not far from our house. She came over for Sunday dinners nearly every week. She was the girls' favorite aunt, always bringing them little treats, always willing to babysit, always there for every birthday party and school play. When Diane married Paul Hutchins in 1990, we were thrilled. Paul was a contractor, a solid guy who seemed to genuinely love her. They bought a house about 15 minutes from ours. For a while, everything seemed perfect. We had family dinners every Sunday, celebrated holidays together, took a joint vacation to the Ozarks one summer where our kids ran wild and we adults sat on the porch drinking beer and watching the fireflies. But Paul and Diane's marriage started showing cracks around 1998. I noticed it first in small ways. Diane would mention offhand that Paul was working late again, or that they'd had an argument about money, or that he'd canceled plans to go fishing with his buddies instead. By 2001, they'd separated. By 2002, they were divorced. Diane told me that Paul had been emotionally distant, that they'd grown apart, that she couldn't stay in a marriage where she felt invisible. I held her while she cried in my kitchen, helped her move her things out of their house, let her stay in our guest room for 2 weeks while she found a new apartment. I never once suspected that the timeline of Diane's divorce would overlap so conveniently with the timeline of what I'd later discover. I never once thought to question why Martin was suddenly so concerned about Diane's well-being, why he volunteered to help her move her furniture, why he suggested we include her in even more of our family events so she wouldn't feel alone. I thought my husband was being kind. I thought he was being a good man, helping my grieving cousin through a difficult time. I was so blind. Or maybe I wasn't blind at all. Maybe I just wasn't ready to see. The years between 2003 and 2023 were, on the surface, unremarkable. They were the years when life was just life. The girls grew up, went to college, started their own lives. Rebecca graduated from the University of Iowa in 2007 with a degree in business and moved to Des Moines for a job in marketing. Sarah went to cosmetology school and opened her own hair salon in Cedar Rapids in 2011. Martin continued working, eventually starting his own accounting practice in 2010. I went back to teaching full-time after the girls were out of high school, pouring myself into my second-grade classroom, loving every minute of watching young minds discover reading and math and the joy of learning. On the surface, Martin and I were fine. We had our routine: coffee together in the morning before work, dinner at 6 o'clock every evening, church on Sundays. We took one trip a year, usually something modest: a long weekend in Chicago, a few days in Galena, Illinois, once a cruise to the Bahamas for our 30th anniversary. We watched Jeopardy together every night. We split the household chores without much discussion. We had the kind of marriage that from the outside looked stable, comfortable, successful. But underneath, there was distance, a space between us that grew wider year by year, so gradually that I barely noticed it happening. Martin was often distracted, his mind somewhere else, even when we were together. Our intimate life dwindled to almost nothing, which I attributed to age, to stress, to the natural evolution of a long marriage. We stopped having deep conversations. We stopped making future plans together. We existed side by side rather than together, two people sharing a house and a life, but not really connecting anymore. And Diane was always there, always present, always part of our lives, always at Sunday dinner, always at family events, always calling Martin to help her with something at her house: a leaky faucet, a stuck door, her taxes. I thought it was normal. I thought that's what family did for each other. I thought I was lucky to have such a close family, to have my cousin as such a constant in our lives, even as the girls grew up and moved away. I thought a lot of things, and I was wrong about all of them. There were signs. Of course there were signs. But when you trust someone completely, when you've built your entire adult life around the assumption of their honesty and loyalty, it's astonishing how easy it is to explain away anything that doesn't fit the narrative you've constructed. The human brain is remarkable at protecting itself from truths it isn't ready to face. Mine certainly was. Looking back now with the clarity that only hindsight and devastating truth can provide, I can identify the moment when my comfortable, stable life started to shift off its axis. It was in 2003, the year Rebecca started college, the year I went back to teaching full-time, the year that Martin's schedule somehow became even more demanding, despite the fact that he'd been working in the same position for years. At the time, I was just grateful to have the extra income from my return to full-time teaching. The girls' college expenses were mounting, and Martin had mentioned several times that money was tight. I threw myself into my work with enthusiasm, reconnecting with the pure joy of teaching that I'd missed during my years of part-time work. I loved my students. I loved creating lesson plans, decorating my classroom, watching children's faces light up when they mastered a new concept. My second-grade classroom became my sanctuary, a place where things made sense, where effort yielded results, where I had control. Meanwhile, at home, Martin and I settled into a new rhythm. With the girls gone and both of us working full-time, our interactions became more perfunctory, more businesslike. We were managing a household rather than building a life together. I'd come home exhausted from a day of teaching, grade papers while heating up leftovers, and Martin would arrive around 7 or 8 in the evening, claiming he'd been working late or meeting with clients. We'd watch an hour of television together, discuss practical matters, bills to pay, repairs the house needed, plans for the weekend, and then head to bed. Our conversations never went deeper than surface logistics. The intimate part of our marriage had essentially ended by 2005. Martin always had an excuse. He was tired. He was stressed about work. His back was bothering him. I told myself it was normal for couples in their late 40s and early 50s. I told myself that companionship and partnership were more important than passion after so many years of marriage. I told myself that the friendship we'd built over 2 decades was enough. I pushed down the small voice that whispered that something was wrong, that this level of disconnection wasn't normal, that married people should still want each other even after 20-plus years. Diane, meanwhile, had rebuilt her life after her divorce from Paul. She'd bought a small house on the south side of Cedar Rapids, continued working as a nurse at St. Luke's, and seemed to be thriving as a single woman. She dated occasionally but never seriously, which she attributed to being too busy with work and too focused on building her own life. She'd come over for dinner at least twice a week, often more. She and Martin would sometimes sit on the back porch together after dinner, talking and laughing while I cleaned up the kitchen. I'd hear their voices through the window, comfortable and easy, and I'd feel happy that my husband and cousin got along so well. I was so stupid, so willfully, deliberately blind. The first sign, the one that planted a seed of doubt that would take years to grow, came in late 2004. It was a Saturday in November, cold and gray, the kind of day where you want to stay inside under a blanket with a good book. Martin had mentioned at breakfast that he needed to run to the office to pick up some files. He left around 9 in the morning, said he'd be back by noon. By 2 o'clock, he still wasn't home. I called his cell phone. This was back when not everyone was constantly checking their phones yet, and it went straight to voicemail. By 4 o'clock, I was starting to worry. What if he'd been in an accident? What if something had happened? I called his office and got the answering machine. I called Diane, thinking maybe she'd heard from him, needing someone to tell me I was worrying over nothing. She answered on the third ring, her voice slightly breathless. I asked if she'd heard from Martin, explaining that I was worried because he'd been gone for hours and wasn't answering his phone. There was a pause, just a beat too long, before she said no, she hadn't heard from him, and suggested that maybe his phone had died or he'd run into an old friend and lost track of time. Her voice sounded odd, strained, but I was too worried about Martin to process it fully. He came home at 6 o'clock that evening with grocery bags in his arms, apologizing profusely. He said he'd run into a colleague at the office who'd needed help with an urgent tax situation. His phone had died, and then he'd decided to stop at the grocery store on the way home to make up for being gone so long. He'd bought all the ingredients for my favorite meal, pot roast with potatoes and carrots. The explanation was so detailed, so reasonable, accompanied by such a thoughtful gesture, that I pushed down my unease and accepted it. Of course it was fine. Of course there was a logical explanation. Why would I doubt him? But something nagged at me. When I'd called Diane, she'd sounded breathless, like she'd been exercising or rushing. She'd also sounded almost guilty. And Martin's explanation, while complete, felt rehearsed somehow. Too smooth, too prepared. I told myself I was being paranoid, that too many years of watching crime dramas on television were making me suspicious for no reason. The second sign came in the spring of 2006. Martin mentioned casually over dinner that he'd helped Diane refinance her house, that as an accountant he'd been able to get her a better interest rate through some connections. I asked him about it, how much she was saving, what the new terms were, and he became defensive, asking why I needed to know all the details, saying it was Diane's private financial business. The reaction surprised me. Martin had never been secretive about anything before. We'd always been transparent about money, about decisions, about everything. His sudden defensiveness over helping my cousin felt disproportionate to my innocent questions. I let it go. Because that's what I did. I swallowed my concerns and convinced myself I was reading too much into things. The third sign happened in August of 2008. I came home from a week-long teachers' conference in Iowa City to find new furniture in our living room, a leather sofa and love seat set that must have cost several $1,000s. When I expressed surprise, Martin explained that our old couch had finally given out, that he'd found a great deal, and that he wanted to surprise me. The furniture was beautiful, and his explanation made sense. But something about the scenario felt off. I'd been after him for 3 years to replace that couch, and he'd always said we couldn't afford it. Now suddenly we could? And he'd made such a major purchase without consulting me? It felt strange, out of character. But I thanked him for the thoughtful surprise and pushed down the discomfort. Maybe I was just upset that he hadn't included me in the decision. Maybe I was being petty. The fourth sign came in December of 2010. I was doing some end-of-year organizing and noticed that several of our credit card statements were missing from our filing cabinet. When I asked Martin about them, he said he'd switched to online statements to save paper, that he'd set up the accounts himself and hadn't gotten around to giving me the login information. He promised to do it soon. He never did. Every time I brought it up over the next several months, he had an excuse. He was too busy, he'd do it this weekend. He couldn't remember the password and would have to call the company. Eventually, I stopped asking. I trusted him with our finances. He was an accountant, after all. This was his area of expertise. The fifth sign occurred in the summer of 2012. Diane mentioned that she was going to Florida for a week's vacation, asked me if I wanted to go with her, a girls' trip to the beach. I was excited. I hadn't been on a vacation without Martin in years. But when I mentioned it to him that evening, he became strangely upset. He said I couldn't just leave him alone for a week, that he'd planned for us to refinish the deck together during that time, that it was inconsiderate of me to make plans without checking with him first. The reaction was so over the top, so unlike his usually easygoing nature, that I was taken aback. I told Diane I couldn't go. She seemed disappointed but understanding. Looking back now, I wonder if that invitation was genuine at all, or if it was a test to see if Martin would react, to see if I'd notice his inappropriate response. The sixth sign happened in March of 2015. I ran into Janet Fletcher at the grocery store. Janet was married to one of Martin's colleagues from his old firm. She asked me how our cabin was working out, said that her husband had mentioned that Martin had been talking about the place, about how nice it was to have a weekend getaway. I had no idea what she was talking about. We didn't have a cabin. When I told her that, she looked confused, then embarrassed, then quickly changed the subject. When I asked Martin about it that night, he laughed it off. He said Janet must have confused him with someone else, that Bill Fletcher was always mixing people up, that we'd talked years ago about maybe someday buying a cabin up north, but had never done it. His explanation sounded reasonable. Janet was known for being a bit scatterbrained. It was an easy mistake, except it wasn't a mistake at all. The seventh sign was in the fall of 2017. Sarah came over for Sunday dinner and mentioned that she'd seen Aunt Diane and Dad having lunch together at a restaurant downtown during the week. She thought it was odd that they were out together on a Wednesday afternoon, wondered if everything was okay, if maybe Diane had needed help with something. I hadn't known they'd had lunch together. Martin hadn't mentioned it. When I asked him about it later, he said Diane had been having some problems at work, that she'd needed advice, that he'd met her on his lunch break to talk it through. Why hadn't he mentioned it to me? He shrugged and said it hadn't seemed important, just a quick lunch to help out family. But it bothered me, not because I thought there was anything romantic happening, that seemed impossible, unthinkable, but because he hadn't mentioned it, because there was a casualness to the secrecy that felt wrong, because my daughter had known about this lunch before I did. The eighth and final sign that I consciously registered before everything came crashing down happened in May of 2019. I was doing spring cleaning and found a receipt that had fallen behind the dresser in our bedroom. It was from a jewelry store in Cedar Rapids, dated 3 months earlier, for a necklace that cost $700. I hadn't received any jewelry for Christmas or my birthday. I asked Martin about it, wondering if perhaps he'd bought it for one of the girls. He got flustered, said it was for my birthday coming up in a few months, that I'd ruined the surprise, and that he was disappointed I'd been snooping. I felt terrible for ruining his surprise. I apologized profusely. My birthday came and went that year. I never received a necklace. When I gently mentioned it afterward, Martin claimed he'd returned it because I'd already seen the receipt, and the surprise was ruined. So what was the point? I accepted this explanation because by then, I'd spent 16 years accepting explanations, swallowing doubts, rationalizing away every single warning sign that my gut was screaming at me to notice. I'd become an expert at self-deception, at protecting myself from truths I wasn't ready to face, at maintaining the comfortable fiction of my stable, boring, safe marriage to my reliable, predictable, trustworthy husband. But deep down, in a place I wouldn't let myself consciously acknowledge, I knew something was wrong. I knew it in the way you know things in your bones, in your gut, in the parts of your brain that evolution designed to keep you safe from predators. My body knew even when my mind refused to accept it. I started having trouble sleeping. I developed tension headaches that wouldn't respond to medication. I found myself crying sometimes for no reason I could name. I felt anxious and on edge without being able to identify why. My doctor suggested I might be experiencing depression related to menopause and the empty nest syndrome. She prescribed an antidepressant. I took it faithfully for 3 years, thinking there was something wrong with me, thinking I was broken somehow, that my inability to feel happy in my perfectly fine life was a personal failing, a chemical imbalance, a problem to be medicated away. It never occurred to me that my symptoms weren't depression at all. They were intuition. They were my body's way of trying to tell me something my mind refused to hear. They were warning bells that I kept silencing because the truth was too terrible to contemplate. By 2023, 40 years into my marriage, I had become a stranger to myself. I'd spent so long denying my own perceptions, questioning my own judgment, that I no longer trusted my own mind. I felt like I was living in a fog, going through the motions of my life without really being present in it. I taught my second graders with genuine love and dedication, but the moment I walked out of that classroom, the fog descended again. I existed rather than lived. I survived rather than thrived. And then I found the box in the attic, and everything changed. The box sat in front of me on the attic floor, its contents spread out like evidence at a crime scene, which in a way it was. The crime of betrayal, of deception, of stealing 20 years of someone's life while convincing them they were the crazy one for suspecting anything was wrong. My hands moved almost automatically, picking up documents and examining them with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned long ago to detach emotionally in order to function. It was the same survival mechanism I'd developed as a teenager after my brother died, the same protective numbness that had allowed me to push through the past 2 decades of slowly growing wrongness in my marriage. The first folder contained bank statements for an account at Wells Fargo that I'd never known existed. The account had been opened in May of 2003, almost exactly 20 years ago. The opening balance was $5,000. Over the years, regular deposits had been made, ranging from $200 to $500 every month. The current balance, as of the most recent statement dated August 2023, was over $87,000. $87,000. Money that came from somewhere. Money that I'd never seen, never benefited from, never even known existed. I thought about all the times Martin had told me we needed to budget carefully, that money was tight, that we couldn't afford this repair or that vacation. I thought about the year I'd gone without a new winter coat because we were supposedly saving for Sarah's cosmetology school tuition. I thought about eating hamburger instead of steak, driving our cars until they literally wouldn't run anymore, choosing the cheaper option at every turn because we were a working-class family who had to be careful with money. The next folder contained property records. In 2004, Martin had purchased a cabin in Decorah, Iowa, about 2 hours north of Cedar Rapids. The property was just over 3 acres with a 2-bedroom cabin overlooking a small lake. Purchase price, $95,000. He'd put $30,000 down and financed the rest. The deed was in his name only. We'd been married 21 years when he bought it, which meant Iowa law would probably consider it marital property, but he'd kept it entirely separate from our life together. The mortgage was paid off in 2018. The property was now worth approximately $250,000, according to a recent appraisal I found in the folder. This was the cabin Janet Fletcher had mentioned back in 2015. The cabin Martin had told me didn't exist, that I'd misunderstood, that Janet had confused him with someone else. It was real. It had been real for 19 years. And I'd never seen it, never been invited to it, never even known my husband owned property beyond our house. There were utility bills for the cabin dating back to 2004. Electric bills that showed regular usage every single month, not the minimal usage you'd expect from a vacation property used occasionally. Someone was living there regularly, or at least visiting often enough to run up normal household electric bills. There were receipts for furniture purchased for the cabin, for dishes, for linens, for a smart TV that Martin had bought in 2020 when he'd told me we couldn't afford to upgrade ours at home. The third folder contained credit card statements for a MasterCard account I'd never seen. The card had been opened in 2003 as well. Everything seemed to circle back to that year. The year Rebecca went to college, the year I went back to full-time teaching, the year Martin apparently decided to construct an entirely separate financial life. The charges on this card told a story that made my stomach turn. Restaurants I'd never been to with my husband, hotels in towns around Iowa, purchases from Victoria's Secret, from jewelry stores, from boutique clothing shops. The $700 necklace receipt I'd found behind our dresser had been just one of many jewelry purchases I'd never seen. In early 2023, there was a charge at a place called Bella Vita Italian Restaurant in Decorah for $237. The date was February 14th, Valentine's Day. I'd spent Valentine's Day 2023 at home alone, heating up leftover lasagna, because Martin had told me he had to work late on a big client's taxes. While I ate alone in our kitchen, he'd been 2 hours away at a romantic Italian restaurant, spending more on one dinner than we usually spent on groceries for a week. The fourth folder was labeled Insurance. Inside were policies I'd never seen. Life insurance policies on Martin, with Diane, listed as the primary beneficiary. The policies had been taken out in 2005, each one worth $250,000. If Martin died, Diane would receive $500,000. I was listed as a secondary beneficiary, meaning I'd only get the money if Diane died before collecting it. Let that sink in for a moment. My husband had life insurance policies worth $500,000 where my cousin, who I'd treated like a sister my entire life, was listed to receive the money before me, his wife of over 40 years. There was also a copy of Martin's will, dated 2006 and never updated. In it, he left the cabin to Diane outright. He left the secret bank account to Diane. He left me the house we'd lived in together for 40 years, the house that still had a mortgage we were paying off, and split his retirement account between me and the girls. But every asset he'd acquired after 2003, every secret property and account, went to Diane. His will made it clear that there were two parts of his life: the official one he shared with me, and the real one he'd built with her. But it was the photographs that truly destroyed me. Not because they showed Martin and Diane in compromising positions. They didn't. They showed something worse. They showed a life. A whole, complete, comfortable life that had been running parallel to mine for 20 years. There were photos of them at the cabin in every season. Summer photos of them on the dock, fishing poles in hand, beer bottles sweating in the heat. Fall photos of them on the porch, wrapped in blankets, leaves turning gold and red around them. Winter photos of them in front of a roaring fireplace, snow visible through the windows. Spring photos of them working in a garden I'd never seen, planting flowers that would bloom for just the two of them. There were photos from restaurants, from day trips, from what looked like a weekend in Door County, Wisconsin. In every single photo, they looked happy. Not furtive or guilty or secretive, but genuinely, comfortably happy. They looked like a couple. They looked like they belonged together. Martin's arm was around Diane in most of the photos, and the way his hand rested on her shoulder, the way she leaned into him, spoke of years of familiarity and intimacy. There was one photo that particularly struck me. It was from 2015, based on the metadata when I later checked the digital file. They were standing in front of the cabin, both holding coffee mugs, both in pajamas, both looking slightly rumpled and relaxed. Martin was looking at Diane the way I couldn't remember him looking at me in decades. His face was soft, unguarded, full of warmth. She was laughing at something, her face turned up toward his, and he was looking down at her with an expression that could only be described as adoration. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't an affair in the traditional sense of sneaking around for quick physical encounters. This was a relationship. This was a second life. For 20 years, while I'd been teaching my second graders and having dinner with him every night and sleeping in the same bed, he'd been building an entire alternative existence with my cousin. They had a home together. They had routines together. They had inside jokes and shared memories and a history that was completely separate from me. The worst part, the part that made me set down the photos with shaking hands and actually sit down on the dusty attic floor, was that I'd helped facilitate it. Every time I'd been happy that Martin and Diane got along so well. Every time I'd been glad that Diane was such a big part of our family. Every time I'd welcomed her into our home, included her in our holidays, relied on her for babysitting and support and companionship. I'd been happy that the two people I trusted most had such a good relationship. I'd thought I was lucky. I sat there on that attic floor, surrounded by the evidence of 2 decades of betrayal, and I started to laugh. Not hysterical laughter, but the kind of laugh that comes when something is so absurd, so completely outrageous, that your brain can't process it any other way. I'd been worried I was going crazy. I'd been medicated for depression. I'd questioned my own judgment and intuition for years. And all along, I'd been completely right. My instincts had been screaming the truth at me, and I'd just been too trusting, too committed to believing in the fundamental goodness and honesty of my husband and cousin, to listen. The relief I felt in that moment was profound. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. I wasn't imagining things. Every suspicion I'd had, every doubt I'd swallowed, every warning sign I'd rationalized away, all of it had been true. My perception of reality had been accurate. I'd just been lied to so consistently, so thoroughly, by 2 people who were supposed to love me that I doubted my own mind rather than accept that they could betray me so completely. I carefully put all the documents back in the box. My hands were steady. My breathing was normal. I felt eerily calm, almost detached, as if I was watching myself from a distance. I carried the box downstairs to our bedroom and slid it under the bed. Then I went to the bathroom, washed my face, reapplied my lipstick, and went down to the kitchen to start preparing dinner. Martin would be home in an hour. We were having pork chops and roasted vegetables. I needed to preheat the oven and season the meat. Because here's what I'd learned in my 66 years on this planet, and especially in the past 20 years of living with an increasing sense that something was fundamentally wrong. You survive by maintaining normalcy until you're ready to act. You don't confront without a plan. You don't show your hand until you've figured out your next move. You smile and cook dinner and go through the motions while your brain works in the background, processing, calculating, deciding what to do with information that changes everything. So that's what I did. I made dinner. I set the table. When Martin came home at 6:15 that Tuesday evening, I kissed his cheek and asked about his day, just like I had for 40 years. We ate dinner together. We discussed his upcoming dental appointment and whether we needed to replace the garbage disposal. We watched Jeopardy. We went to bed. And the entire time, that box sat under our bed, containing evidence of a betrayal so vast, so encompassing, that I couldn't yet fully wrap my mind around its implications. I'd stumbled upon the truth, but I wasn't ready to confront it yet. I needed time to think, to plan, to decide how to handle this revelation. Because after 20 years of living with deception, another few weeks of pretending wouldn't kill me. But ending this the wrong way, reacting emotionally without a clear strategy, might. The next 3 weeks were among the strangest of my life. I went through my days in a state of heightened awareness that felt almost surreal. I taught my second graders with the same warmth and dedication I always had, but when I looked at their innocent faces, I thought about trust and how we teach children to trust adults, to believe what they're told, to accept the reality that's presented to them. Was I doing them a disservice by not also teaching them that sometimes the people who claim to love you will lie to your face for decades? At home, I watched Martin with new eyes. I noticed things I'd trained myself not to see for years, the way he checked his phone constantly and angled it away from me when he was typing, the way he showered and changed clothes before meeting me for dinner on the nights he claimed he was coming straight from the office, the way he was always vague about his plans for the weekend, keeping his schedule flexible in case Diane needed him, or in case he'd already made plans with her that he couldn't tell me about. I also watched myself, fascinated by my own ability to maintain a facade of normalcy. I smiled at Martin over morning coffee. I asked about his day. I reminded him to pick up his dry cleaning. I functioned exactly as I had before finding that box, except now I was doing it consciously, deliberately, as a strategy rather than out of genuine partnership. It was like I'd become an actress in my own life, playing the role of the devoted wife while my actual thoughts and feelings were locked away somewhere he couldn't reach. I didn't immediately pull all the documents back out and study them, though I was tempted. I needed time to emotionally process what I'd learned before I could think practically about what to do with the information. The initial numbness was wearing off, replaced by waves of grief that would hit me at unexpected moments. I'd be in the middle of teaching a lesson about addition and subtraction, and suddenly I'd have to swallow hard against the tears that wanted to come. I'd be loading the dishwasher and have to grip the counter as a wave of rage so intense it made me dizzy washed over me. I'd be driving home from the grocery store and have to pull over because I couldn't see through my tears. But I never let Martin see any of it. I cried in my classroom during my planning period with the door locked. I cried in my car in the grocery store parking lot. I cried in the shower where the sound of the water would cover any noise I made. At home, in front of Martin, I was perfectly fine. Because I'd become an expert at that over the past 20 years. Being fine when I wasn't, pushing down my real feelings, maintaining the appearance of normalcy even when everything inside me was screaming. I found myself thinking obsessively about specific moments from the past 2 decades, re-examining them through the lens of what I now knew. That Saturday in November 2004, when Martin had been gone for 9 hours and came home with groceries and a rehearsed story, he'd been with Diane at the cabin, probably. Their first time there together, maybe. The furniture Martin had bought without consulting me in 2008, had Diane helped him pick it out? Had she been at our house while I was gone, sitting on our old couch with my husband, planning what new furniture to buy for our living room? Every Sunday dinner where Diane had sat at our table, eating food I'd cooked, laughing at Martin's jokes, hugging me goodbye and telling me she loved me. Every Christmas where she'd given thoughtful gifts to the girls, where she'd helped me in the kitchen, where she'd been photographed as part of our family. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday evening, where she'd called our house to talk to Martin about some household problem she needed help with. It was all a lie. Every single moment had been a performance. When Diane hugged me, when she told me I was her favorite cousin, when she cried to me about her divorce from Paul, when she asked for advice about her job or her dating life or her struggles, all of it had been theater. She was sleeping with my husband. She was maintaining a secret relationship that spanned 2 decades, and she did it while looking me in the eye and calling me family. The audacity of it was breathtaking. The calculated nature of the deception was staggering. This wasn't a drunken mistake or a moment of weakness. This was systematic, planned, maintained through thousands of individual decisions over 20 years. 20 years of Martin choosing to lie to me. 20 years of Diane choosing to betray the cousin she claimed to love like a sister. 20 years of both of them sitting across from me at the dinner table, sharing meals and conversations and holidays, all while maintaining this massive double life. I realized that almost nothing about our marriage had been real after 2003. Every loving word Martin had said to me after that year was tainted by his secret life with Diane. Every time he'd told me he loved me, every anniversary celebration, every seemingly thoughtful gesture, all of it existed in the context of him maintaining a relationship with another woman. I wasn't his partner. I was his cover story. I was the respectable wife who made him look normal, who gave him legitimacy, who freed him to conduct his real relationship because no one suspects a man with a steady marriage of carrying on with his wife's cousin. About a week after finding the box, I was at the grocery store when I ran into Lorraine Williams, one of my closest friends from church. Lorraine was 70, sharp as a tack, and had been married to her husband Tom for 48 years. We often sat together during services and occasionally met for coffee on Saturday mornings. She took one look at my face and said I needed to talk to her. Not asked if I wanted to talk, said I needed to. We ended up at a coffee shop on the east side of Cedar Rapids, sitting in a corner booth where no one could hear us. And I told her everything. About finding the box. About the bank accounts and the cabin and the photos. About 20 years of betrayal that I'd somehow both known and not known about simultaneously. Lorraine listened without interrupting, her face growing more and more grave as I spoke. When I finished, she reached across the table and took both my hands in hers. She told me that she'd suspected something was going on for years. She'd seen Martin and Diane together at a restaurant once, about 5 years ago, and something about the way they were sitting, the way they were looking at each other, had struck her as wrong. But she'd convinced herself she was imagining things, that she shouldn't say anything based on nothing but a feeling. Now she felt terrible for not speaking up. I told her it wouldn't have mattered. I wouldn't have believed her. I'd spent 20 years refusing to believe my own instincts. I certainly wouldn't have believed someone else's suspicions, no matter how well-intentioned. We talked for 3 hours that day. Lorraine asked me what I was going to do. I told her honestly that I didn't know yet. I knew I couldn't stay in this marriage, that much was clear. The question was how to end it, what to say, how to handle the logistics. We had a house together, joint bank accounts, 40 years of intertwined finances. We had daughters who would be devastated. We had friends and family, and a whole community who thought we had a strong marriage. And then there was the question of Diane. What did I do about her? She was family. Our mothers were sisters. We'd grown up together. We shared grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, a whole extended family network. Exposing what she'd done wouldn't just affect her and me, it would ripple through our entire family, causing pain and division and forcing people to take sides. Lorraine said something that day that stuck with me. She said that I needed to think about what would give me peace, not what would give me revenge. She said that anger was natural and justified, but that I needed to find a way forward that would let me build a new life, not just burn down the old one. She said I deserved to find out who I was outside of this betrayal, outside of being the woman who'd been lied to for 20 years. She was right, but I wasn't ready to hear it yet. Because beneath the grief and shock, anger was building. A cold, calculated anger that was nothing like the hot rage I'd felt in those first moments of discovery. This anger was patient. It was strategic. It wanted justice, not just confrontation. And it was starting to formulate a plan. Calibrated section lengths and strategized narrative tension development. I'm now at around 7,500 words, which is good progress for the first 4 sections. But I need to check against my targets. Section 1, 700 words. Section 2, 500 words. Section 3, 500 words. I need to verify I hit this section 4. 500 to 300 words. Currently working on this. Let me continue developing section 4 to ensure it reaches 500 to 300 words before moving to section 5. I need to develop more about the investigation phase, her emotional preparation, and the building tension before the climax. That evening at dinner, Martin seemed distracted. He kept checking his phone, something he'd always claimed annoyed him when other people did it at the table. I asked if everything was okay, and he said work was just busy, a big client with a complicated situation. I nodded and smiled and asked if he wanted more potatoes. The whole time, I was thinking about the photos I'd seen of him and Diane at the cabin, wondering if he was texting her right now, wondering if they were making plans for another weekend getaway while I sat across from him playing the role of the oblivious wife. The next Sunday, Diane came over for dinner as usual. I'd spent hours debating whether I should cancel, whether I could sit across from her and maintain my composure. But canceling would have been suspicious, would have signaled that something had changed. So I made pot roast, the same meal I'd been making for Sunday dinners for 30 years. And I welcomed her into my home like I had hundreds of times before. Watching her interact with Martin that evening was excruciating and illuminating in equal measure. I saw things I'd never noticed before, or maybe I'd noticed but explained away. The casual way she touched his shoulder when she walked past him to get to the kitchen, the inside jokes they shared that I wasn't part of. The way they both knew where things were in the cabin when the conversation turned to weekend plans. Diane mentioned needing to get away for some peace and quiet, and Martin suggested she might like somewhere up north with a lake view, and they shared a look that lasted just a fraction of a second too long. My daughters were both there that evening. Rebecca had driven in from Des Moines, and Sarah had closed her salon early to make it to dinner. Watching my girls laugh and chat with their Aunt Diane, watching them hug her goodbye, knowing that this woman who'd been such a constant in their lives had been betraying their mother for their entire adult lives, made me want to scream. But I smiled and served dessert and asked Rebecca about her new marketing campaign and Sarah about her salon's new location. After everyone left, after Martin had gone to bed claiming exhaustion, I pulled out the box again. This time I went through it methodically, taking notes, organizing the information chronologically, building a timeline of the affair. I photocopied every document, creating a backup set that I stored in my classroom at school, hidden in the back of my supply closet where no one would ever think to look. I also started doing my own investigation. I created a fake email account and used it to access public property records online. The cabin in Decorah was definitely real, purchased by Martin in 2004, currently assessed at $250,000. I looked up the address on Google Street View and saw a charming 2-bedroom cabin with a wraparound porch, nestled among pine trees with a glimpse of lake visible through the branches. It looked peaceful, romantic, like exactly the kind of place a couple would go to escape from the world. I checked our joint bank account transactions going back years, something I realized I hadn't done in ages despite the fact that I had online access. I'd trusted Martin to handle our finances. He was the accountant after all. Now, looking through the transactions with suspicious eyes, I saw patterns I'd missed before. Cash withdrawals of $300 to $500 several times a month, always in round numbers, always from ATMs. Where had that money gone? To fund the secret account, probably. To pay for dinners at restaurants I'd never been to and gifts I'd never received. I saw charges to gas stations in Decorah on weekends when Martin had told me he was working or running errands. I saw charges to restaurants on weeknights when he'd claimed to be working late. I saw a pattern of deception so pervasive, so thoroughly woven through our daily life, that I marveled at the energy it must have taken to maintain it. Lying is exhausting. Living a double life requires constant vigilance, constant cover stories, constant management of details. Martin and Diane had been doing it for 20 years. The dedication was almost impressive in its awfulness. I also started paying closer attention to Martin's schedule. I noticed that he had several standing client meetings that happened like clockwork, every other Wednesday evening, every other Saturday afternoon, 2 weekends a month where he'd disappear for the entire time. When I started asking more pointed questions about these clients, he became irritated, accused me of not trusting him, said he didn't appreciate being interrogated after 40 years of marriage. The defensiveness was telling. An innocent person would have simply answered the questions. The realization that Martin felt confident enough in my blind trust to become angry when questioned, to turn the tables and make me feel bad for asking, sparked something dark and cold in my chest. He thought I was so thoroughly beaten down, so completely convinced of my own paranoia, that he could actually make me feel guilty for daring to question him. 20 years of gaslighting had trained me to doubt myself so completely that even when I had proof, even when my instincts were screaming the truth, he expected me to back down and apologize for suspecting him. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to confront him. I wasn't just going to file for divorce and divide assets and move on. I was going to make sure that everyone knew what he'd done. I was going to make sure that the respectable image he'd cultivated, the good husband facade he'd maintained, the family man persona he'd hidden behind while betraying me with my own cousin, all of it was going to crumble. I was going to expose both of them. I was going to make sure that every single person who'd seen us as a happy family, who'd envied our closeness, who'd commented on what a blessing it was that Diane and Martin got along so well, knew the truth. Was it revenge? Yes. But it was also justice. It was also truth-telling after 2 decades of lies. It was taking back my narrative from two people who'd been writing it behind my back for 20 years. I spent another week gathering additional evidence. I drove up to Decorah one Saturday when Martin claimed he had to work all day on a client's quarterly taxes. I found the cabin easily. It was exactly where the property records said it would be. Martin's car was parked in the driveway. So was Diane's SUV. I didn't approach the cabin. I didn't need to. The sight of both vehicles there together, while Martin had told me he was at the office and Diane had told me she was working a shift at the hospital, was all the confirmation I needed. I took photos of both vehicles with my phone, making sure the license plates were clearly visible, making sure the cabin was identifiable in the background. Then I drove home, stopping at the grocery store to establish an alibi for my own absence, and was putting away groceries when Martin called around 3 o'clock to say he'd be home by 6, that he was sorry he'd had to work all day Saturday, that he'd pick up Chinese food on the way home to make it up to me. I thanked him sweetly and said that sounded lovely. Then I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table and cried until I couldn't breathe. Not because I was surprised or hurt anymore. The initial shock and grief had already been processed. I cried because of the sheer magnitude of the deception. The casual ease with which he'd lied to me while standing in the cabin he shared with my cousin, the way he thought I was too stupid or too trusting to ever figure it out. But I had figured it out. And now it was time to decide what to do with that knowledge. The moment everything crystallized, the moment I knew exactly what I needed to do and how I needed to do it, came on a Thursday evening in early October. Martin and I were sitting in the living room, watching television, when my phone rang. It was Diane. She was crying, her voice thick with emotion, saying she needed to talk to me right away, that something terrible had happened. My first instinct was concern. Even knowing what I knew, even after weeks of planning and gathering evidence, my first reaction to her distress was worry. 20-plus years of conditioning don't disappear overnight. I asked her what was wrong. Was she hurt? Did she need me to come over? She said no, she just needed to talk. Could she come by the house? I looked at Martin, who was watching me with mild curiosity, and said of course she could come over. We'd be here. Diane arrived 20 minutes later, her face blotchy from crying, her eyes red and puffy. She sat on our couch, the couch Martin had bought without consulting me, possibly with Diane's help, and told us that she'd been diagnosed with breast cancer. Stage 2. She'd found a lump 3 weeks ago, had been through a biopsy and imaging, and now they were talking about surgery and chemotherapy and radiation. She was terrified. She kept saying she couldn't do this alone, that she needed her family, needed us. I watched Martin's face as she spoke. I saw genuine fear and concern there, saw his hand reach for hers and squeeze tight, saw his eyes fill with tears. This was real emotion. Whatever else their relationship was, however it had started, however many lies had been told, he loved her. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about sex or convenience or excitement. My husband genuinely loved my cousin. After 40 years of marriage to me, he loved someone else. Maybe he'd even loved her more than he'd ever loved me. I went into crisis mode automatically. I asked questions about her doctors, about treatment options, about her prognosis. I held her while she cried. I told her everything would be okay, that we'd get through this together, that she wasn't alone. And I meant it, in that moment. Because that's who I am. Someone who shows up for people in crisis, even people who've betrayed me, even when showing up makes me feel like I'm betraying myself. But later that night, after Diane had gone home and Martin had gone to bed, I sat alone in the darkness of our living room, and something shifted inside me. The universe had handed me an opportunity. Diane's cancer diagnosis, terrible as it was, had given me information I could use. It had shown me that Martin's feelings for her were real and deep. It had shown me that exposing their affair wouldn't just embarrass them or damage their reputations. It would destroy something Martin actually valued. It would cost him something he genuinely cared about. And suddenly, I knew what I needed to do. I needed to wait. I needed to let Diane go through her treatment. Let Martin support her through it publicly as her concerned family member. Let both of them think I was completely oblivious. I needed to give them just enough rope, just enough security, just enough false confidence in my continued blindness for them to truly relax into their deception. And then, when the time was right, when they least expected it, I would pull the rug out from under both of them simultaneously. It sounds cruel, doesn't it? Waiting while Diane fought cancer, planning revenge while she went through chemotherapy, biding my time while she faced a genuine health crisis. But here's what you need to understand. I wasn't planning to interfere with her treatment or make her medical situation worse. I was simply recognizing that the universe had given me a timeline. I couldn't expose them while she was actively sick. I'm not a monster, and besides, sympathy for her illness would overshadow the betrayal. I needed to wait until she was through treatment, until she was recovering, until everyone's focus had shifted from her health crisis back to normal life. That's when the truth would have maximum impact. So I became the most devoted cousin and sister-in-law anyone could ask for. I drove Diane to her chemotherapy appointments. I sat with her during her 6-hour infusion sessions, holding her hand, bringing her magazines and snacks, distracting her from the poison dripping into her veins that was killing her cancer cells and making her feel like death. I cooked meals for her and delivered them in carefully labeled containers. I helped her shop for wigs when her hair started falling out. I was there for every step of her treatment, and I did it with genuine compassion, because whatever she'd done to me, cancer was a terrible thing to face. But I also did it strategically. I made sure everyone saw how devoted I was. I made sure our entire family, our church community, our mutual friends, all witnessed me being the perfect supportive cousin. I was building a contrast that would make the eventual revelation even more powerful. When the truth came out, everyone would remember how I'd stood by Diane through cancer while she was sleeping with my husband. The betrayal would be even more stark, more unforgivable. Martin, meanwhile, was torn between relief that I was helping Diane so much and anxiety about how much time I was spending with her, how many opportunities I had to notice things, to ask questions, to accidentally discover something that would reveal their secret. I could see the stress on his face sometimes when I'd come home from one of Diane's appointments and give him a detailed update on her condition and treatment. He was worried I'd figure something out. He had no idea I already knew everything. Diane's surgery was scheduled for November, a lumpectomy followed by 6 weeks of radiation. The prognosis was good. The cancer hadn't spread to her lymph nodes, and her doctors were optimistic that with treatment, she had an excellent chance of full recovery. I was genuinely relieved to hear this. I wanted her to recover. I wanted her to be healthy and cancer-free. I wanted her to have a long life ahead of her. And then I wanted to make sure everyone knew what she'd done during that long, healthy life she'd been given. In December, while Diane was going through radiation, I started putting together my plan in detail. I consulted with a lawyer, telling him I was considering divorce and wanted to understand my options. Iowa is a no-fault divorce state, which meant the affair itself wouldn't impact the division of assets legally, but the secret accounts and hidden property were a different story. The lawyer explained that any assets acquired during the marriage were marital property, regardless of whose name was on the account or deed. The cabin in Decorah, purchased with marital funds during our marriage? Half mine. The secret bank account, funded with money that should have been part of our family budget? Half mine. Martin's attempt to hide assets could actually work in my favor in court. I also learned about something called dissipation of marital assets, which meant that if Martin had been using marital funds to support an affair, paying for dinners, trips, gifts for Diane, maintaining the cabin for their use, I could potentially be entitled to more than half of our assets to compensate for his misuse of joint money. The lawyer's eyes had lit up when I showed him copies of the bank statements and credit card records showing 20 years of charges that benefited only Martin and Diane. This was, he said, a very strong case. I decided not to file for divorce yet. I wanted more time to prepare, more time to think through every angle, more time to make sure that when I acted, I did it right. I also wanted Diane to be through her treatment, to be healthy enough to face the consequences of her actions without any sympathy protection. By February 2024, Diane had completed her radiation treatments. Her scans were clear. Her doctors declared her cancer-free and put her on a 5-year monitoring schedule. She was exhausted and worn down from months of treatment, but she was recovering. We had a small celebration dinner at our house, just Martin, Diane, the girls, and me. I made Diane's favorite meal, baked salmon with roasted asparagus. I gave a toast to her health, to her strength, to the blessing of having her in our lives. Martin's eyes were shining with tears as he squeezed her hand across the table. The entire time I was thinking about the box under my bed, about the timeline I'd built, about the lawyer consultations I'd had, about the copies of documents stored in my classroom, about the photos of their vehicles at the cabin, about 20 years of lies that were about to come crashing down on both of them. I was thinking that betrayal is a dish best served ice cold, after you've had time to plan every detail, after you've gathered every piece of evidence, after you've made sure that there's no way for the people who hurt you to deny what they've done or escape the consequences of their choices. I was thinking that I'd spent 20 years being the naive, trusting wife who believed every lie she was told. But those 20 years had taught me patience. They'd taught me how to hide my true thoughts and feelings behind a pleasant facade. They'd taught me how to play the long game. Martin and Diane thought they'd gotten away with their deception because I was too stupid or too weak to figure it out. They were about to learn that quiet doesn't mean weak, and patience doesn't mean ignorance. They were about to learn that some people, when betrayed badly enough, don't get mad and they don't get sad. They get methodical, they get strategic, they get even. By March 2024, I had everything in place. I'd consulted with 3 different lawyers and chosen the one I felt most comfortable with, a woman named Sandra Rodriguez who specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for being thorough and aggressive. I'd provided her with copies of all the documents I'd found, along with the photos I'd taken of Martin and Diane's cars at the cabin. I'd opened my own bank account at a different bank and had my paycheck deposited there instead of our joint account. I'd slowly been moving money from our joint savings to my personal account. Not large amounts that would be noticed, but steady transfers that added up over months. I'd also been documenting everything in real time. Every lie Martin told me about working late, I noted the date and time and what he claimed to be doing. Every weekend he disappeared, I tracked where he claimed to be versus where he actually was. I'd created a detailed log that showed a clear pattern of deception. Sandra had been impressed by my thoroughness. She'd said that many wives come to her with suspicions and emotions, but little hard evidence. I'd come with a case so documented, so meticulously proven, that there would be no room for Martin to claim I was mistaken or exaggerating. The plan was simple in concept, but required precise timing and execution. I would file for divorce on a Friday afternoon after the courthouse closed for the weekend. This would give me the weekend to make sure everyone who mattered knew the truth before Martin and Diane had a chance to control the narrative or come up with damage control strategies. I'd invite the girls over for Sunday dinner, just them without their partners, and I'd tell them everything. I'd give them all the evidence so they could see for themselves that I wasn't imagining things or being vindictive. I needed my daughters to understand the full scope of the betrayal before Martin tried to spin it as a misunderstanding or paint me as the unreasonable one. I also planned to tell my extended family, the aunts and uncles and cousins who'd known Diane and me our whole lives. I'd tell our church community. I'd tell our friends. I wouldn't announce it in a dramatic public way, but I'd make sure that everyone who'd witnessed our supposedly close family dynamic for the past 20 years knew the truth about what had really been going on. I wasn't interested in gossip for gossip's sake, but I was interested in making sure that Martin and Diane couldn't retreat into their secret relationship with their reputations intact. They'd carried on their affair while surrounded by people who trusted them, who included them in family gatherings, who celebrated their closeness. Those same people deserved to know they'd been deceived too. The date I chose was Friday, May 17th, 2024. It was just after Mother's Day, which I'd spent having brunch with my daughters and receiving thoughtful gifts and flowers from both my girls and from Martin, who'd taken me to my favorite restaurant and given me a beautiful bracelet that I later discovered came from the same jewelry store where he'd bought pieces for Diane. The irony of celebrating Mother's Day with a man who'd been lying to me for 20 years, who'd been using marital funds to support his mistress, was not lost on me. But I smiled and thanked him and wore the bracelet, knowing it would be one of the last gifts I'd ever accept from him. The week before May 17th, I made my final preparations. I packed up anything in our house that had sentimental value to me: my mother's jewelry, photo albums of the girls growing up, my grandmother's china, books and mementos that mattered to me. I did it slowly, casually, moving things to my classroom at school where I was packing up for summer break anyway. If Martin noticed that the house was gradually becoming less cluttered, he probably just thought I was doing spring cleaning. I also wrote letters to each of my daughters, separate from the conversation we'd have on Sunday. In these letters, I laid out everything: the timeline, the evidence, my feelings, my pain, but also my determination to move forward and build a new life. I wanted them to have something they could read and reread later, when the initial shock wore off, something that explained my decisions and reassured them that I was strong enough to handle this. I emphasized that my relationship with them was separate from their relationship with their father, that I wasn't asking them to choose sides or cut him out of their lives, but that I needed them to understand the full truth of what had happened. I wrote a similar letter to my mother-in-law, who was 86 and living in an assisted living facility. She deserved to know what her son had done, but I wanted to tell her gently, in writing, so she could process it at her own pace without the pressure of having to respond immediately. Wednesday evening before the Friday I planned to file, Martin came home from work in an unusually good mood. He'd stopped and bought flowers for me, a mixed bouquet of tulips and daisies, and suggested we go out to dinner on Friday night to celebrate the start of the weekend. I agreed, knowing that by Friday night he'd be served with divorce papers and there wouldn't be any celebration. But I thanked him for the flowers and said I'd love to go to dinner, and I kissed him like a wife of 40 years who still loved and trusted her husband. That night, lying in bed next to him in the darkness, I thought about all the years we'd shared this bed, this room, this life. I thought about the young couple we'd been in 1983, full of hope and plans and the simple assumption that marriage meant loyalty and honesty. I thought about the children we'd raised together, the Christmases and birthdays and ordinary Wednesday evenings that had seemed so meaningful at the time. I thought about how much of it had been real and how much had been performance. I thought about whether Martin had ever truly loved me or if I'd just been the practical choice, the respectable wife who gave him cover to conduct the relationship he really wanted with someone else. I also thought about Diane, sleeping in her own house across town, probably texting with Martin late into the night the way she couldn't when I was around. I thought about how she'd stood by my side through my brother's death, through my children's births, through my father's funeral. I thought about how she'd been my bridesmaid, how she'd helped me decorate our first house, how many secrets I'd shared with her over wine on late nights when we'd stayed up talking about life and love and the future. I thought about how completely I'd trusted her, how deeply I'd loved her as family, and how thoroughly she'd betrayed that trust. And I felt nothing. Not anger, not grief, just a cold certainty that what I was about to do was right, fair, necessary. They'd made their choices every single day for 20 years. They'd chosen to lie, to deceive, to betray. Now they'd face the consequences of those choices. Now everyone would know who they really were, not who they pretended to be. Thursday night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there reviewing my plan over and over, making sure I hadn't forgotten anything, making sure I'd covered every angle. At 3 a.m, I got up and went down to the kitchen. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the table where I'd shared thousands of meals with Martin, where I'd helped my daughters with homework, where I'd had coffee with Diane countless times while she lied to my face about her life. The box was no longer under our bed. I'd moved it to Sandra's office, along with all the copies I'd made. But I'd kept one photo, the one from 2015 where Martin and Diane stood in front of the cabin in their pajamas, coffee mugs in hand, looking at each other with genuine affection and joy. I had that photo in my purse. I planned to put it on the table when I told the girls everything on Sunday. Because sometimes seeing is believing, and I needed them to see with their own eyes what their father and their aunt had been to each other. I finished my tea and washed the cup, dried it, put it away. I looked around the kitchen, this room where I'd spent so much of my life, and realized I felt no attachment to it anymore. This house was just a building. It held no good memories now that I knew what had been going on behind my back the entire time I'd lived here. Every holiday dinner, every family gathering, every ordinary moment, all of it was contaminated by the knowledge that I'd been the only one who didn't know the truth. I went back to bed. This time, I slept. Friday, May 17th, 2024, dawned clear and bright. A perfect spring morning in Iowa. The kind of day where everything feels possible and fresh. I got up at my usual time, showered, dressed carefully in one of my nicer outfits, a navy blue dress with a matching cardigan, pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I wanted to look put together, calm, competent. I wanted to walk into that courthouse looking like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why. Martin was already up, drinking coffee and scrolling through his phone at the kitchen table. He looked up when I came in and commented that I looked nice, asked if I had something special planned for the day. I told him I had some errands to run, after school let out for the day. He nodded absently and went back to his phone. I taught my last classes of the day with a strange sense of awareness that my life was about to change in fundamental ways. I looked at my second graders, so innocent and trusting, and hoped that their families would be kinder to them than mine had been to me. I hoped they'd grow up surrounded by people who told them the truth, who honored their commitments, who loved them without hidden agendas or secret betrayals. At 3:30, after my students had been dismissed and I'd finished my end-of-day duties, I drove to Sandra's office in downtown Cedar Rapids. She had all the paperwork ready, the divorce petition, the financial disclosures, the asset inventory that included the cabin in Decorah and the secret bank account, and all the evidence of dissipation of marital assets. We reviewed everything one more time. I signed where I needed to sign. At 4:15, we walked to the Lynn County Courthouse and filed the divorce petition minutes before the clerk's office closed at 4:30 for the weekend. It was done. After 40 years of marriage, after months of planning and gathering evidence and building my case, it was officially over. I was divorcing Martin Sutherland. The court system was now involved. There was no going back. Sandra walked me back to my car. She told me that the sheriff's department would serve Martin with the papers tomorrow morning at our house, that she'd already arranged it. She reminded me that I had every right to be there when he was served, but that I might want to be somewhere else for my own peace of mind. She gave me her personal cell phone number and told me to call any time, day or night, if I needed legal advice or just needed to talk. I drove home in a daze. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. I'd actually done it. I'd filed for divorce. Tomorrow morning, Martin would be served with papers, and he'd know that I knew. He'd know that his decades of deception were over, that his secret life was about to be exposed, that everything he'd carefully built was about to come crashing down. When I got home, Martin was already there, changed out of his work clothes, chopping vegetables for dinner. He asked how my day was. I said it was fine, just busy wrapping up the school year. He told me about a difficult client he'd been dealing with, about some tax issue that was more complicated than expected. I made appropriate sympathetic noises and started setting the table for dinner. We ate together. We talked about ordinary things, whether we needed to hire someone to reseal the driveway, whether the girls might come visit this summer, what we should do for our 41st anniversary in October. I participated in the conversation, knowing that we'd never have a 41st anniversary, that by October I'd likely be living somewhere else entirely, that our marriage, as he understood it, had already ended. He just didn't know it yet. After dinner, I told Martin I was tired and going to bed early. He said he'd join me in a bit. He just wanted to watch the news. I went upstairs, changed into pajamas, and lay in our bed. The bed we'd shared for 40 years. The bed where our daughters had been conceived. The bed where we'd comforted each other through losses and celebrated joys and lived our marriage. Tomorrow night, I'd probably start sleeping in the guest room. The thought didn't make me sad. It made me feel free. I didn't sleep well. I kept jolting awake, my heart pounding, wondering if the sheriff had come yet, if Martin knew. But it was still dark outside, still the middle of the night. I'd check my phone, 2 a.m., then 3:30, then 5:15. Finally, at 6:30, I heard movement downstairs. Martin was up, making coffee, starting his Saturday morning like any other Saturday. I got up, brushed my teeth, pulled a robe over my pajamas, and went downstairs. Martin was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and his iPad, reading the news. He looked up and smiled when I came in, asked if I wanted coffee too. I said yes and poured myself a cup. At 7:42, I'll never forget the exact time, there was a knock at the door, a firm, official knock. Martin looked up, surprised. Who would be at our door at this hour on a Saturday morning? He got up to answer it. I stayed in the kitchen, my hands wrapped around my coffee mug, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I heard Martin open the door. I heard a male voice say, "Martin Sutherland?" I heard Martin confirm his identity. I heard the words I'd been waiting for. "I'm Deputy Anderson with the Lynn County Sheriff's Department. I need to serve you with these documents." There was a long silence. Then I heard rustling paper. More silence. Then Martin's voice, tight and strange. "What is this?" "Divorce petition, sir. You're being served. Have a good day." The door closed. More silence. Then footsteps, slow and heavy, coming toward the kitchen. Martin appeared in the doorway, his face pale, holding the divorce papers in his hand like they were radioactive. He looked at me standing there in the kitchen, coffee mug in my hands, completely calm. Our eyes met, and in that moment, he knew. He knew that I knew everything. He knew that his secret was out. He knew that the life he'd been living for 20 years was over. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked down at the papers in his hand, then back up at me. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Vera, what have you done?" I set down my coffee mug. I walked toward him until I was standing just a few feet away. And I said the words I'd been planning for months, the words I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times, the words that would change everything. "What have I done? I filed for divorce, Martin. I know about Diane. I know about the cabin in Decorah. I know about the secret bank account. I know about the life insurance policies. I know about 20 years of lies. I found the documents in the attic in September. I've known for 8 months, and now everyone else is going to know too." His face went from pale to gray. His hands started shaking, the papers rustling. He groped behind him for a chair and sat down hard, like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "How?" he started, then stopped. "When?" "The box in the attic. Tax documents 2003-2015. One in your handwriting. Except they weren't tax documents, were they? They were evidence. Evidence of everything you and Diane have been doing behind my back for 2 decades. Did you keep them as some kind of souvenir? Were you planning to use them someday to prove your relationship to her was real? Did you just forget they were there?" Martin's face crumpled. To my surprise, he started to cry. Not just tears, but actual sobs, his shoulders shaking, his hands covering his face. Part of me wanted to feel satisfaction at his pain. But mostly I just felt tired, so incredibly tired of all of it. "I'm sorry," he choked out between sobs. "I'm so sorry, Vera. I never meant..." I didn't want to hurt you. You didn't want to hurt me? My voice was cold, hard. You've been sleeping with my cousin for 20 years, Martin. 20 years. You bought a cabin with our money and never told me. You opened secret bank accounts. You wrote a will leaving everything to her. You made her the primary beneficiary on your life insurance. You spent 20 years lying to my face every single day. But you didn't want to hurt me? It's not like that, he said desperately. It wasn't. We didn't plan. It just happened. Nothing just happens for 20 years, Martin. You made choices. Thousands of individual choices. Every time you lied to me. Every time you told me you were working late when you were with her. Every time you claimed you couldn't afford something when you were spending money on her. Every time you sat across from me at dinner while texting her. Those were choices. You chose to betray me. For 20 years. He looked up at me, his face wet with tears and snot, and I saw real devastation there. Whatever else he'd done, however thoroughly he'd deceived me, I could see that facing the end of his double life was destroying him. But I couldn't summon any sympathy. Not after what he'd put me through. Not after the years of gaslighting, of making me doubt my own perception, of making me take medication for depression when the real problem was that I was living a lie. "Does Diane know?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Have you told her you're filing?" I shook my head. "She'll find out soon enough, tomorrow, at our family dinner. I've invited Rebecca and Sarah over to tell them everything. I imagine they'll want to discuss it with Diane. I've also written to your mother. She deserves to know what kind of man she raised. Vera, please." He stood up, reached toward me. I stepped back, putting distance between us. "Please don't do this. Can't we talk about it? Can't we work something out?" Work something out. I almost laughed. What exactly did you have in mind, Martin? Should I just accept that you've been lying to me for 2 decades? Should I share you with Diane? Should I just pretend I don't know and go back to being the oblivious wife while you two continue your relationship? "I'll end it," he said quickly. "I'll end things with Diane. We can go to counseling. We can save our marriage. Vera, please, 40 years together has to count for something. 20 of those years were a lie. The marriage you want to save doesn't exist, Martin. It's been over since 2003. I just didn't know it until now." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him there with his divorce papers and his tears and the ruins of the life he'd tried to maintain. I went upstairs to our bedroom and closed the door. Then I called Sandra to let her know the papers had been served. Then I called Rebecca and confirmed our dinner for tomorrow. Then I called Sarah and did the same. Then I sat on the edge of the bed I'd shared with Martin for 40 years, and I cried. Not because I was sad about losing him. That man, the one who'd lied and cheated and betrayed me so thoroughly, I was glad to be rid of. I cried because I was grieving the man I'd thought he was, the marriage I'd thought I had, the life I'd believed I was living. I cried for 40 years of wasted trust, for 2 decades of stolen time, for the woman I'd been who'd been too kind, too trusting, too willing to doubt herself rather than confront uncomfortable truths. But underneath the grief, there was also relief. It was finally out in the open. No more pretending. No more doubting my own instincts. No more living a lie. Tomorrow, everyone would know. And I could finally start building a new life, a real life, a life based on truth instead of decades of deception. I heard Martin moving around downstairs. A door slammed. A few minutes later, I heard his car start. He was leaving, probably going to Diane to tell her what happened, to warn her that their secret was out, to figure out what to do next. Let them have each other now in the full light of day, without the protection of my ignorance to hide behind. Let them see what their relationship looked like when everyone knew about it, when they had to face the consequences of their choices. I wiped my tears, washed my face, and started planning the rest of my day. I had calls to make, people to talk to, a new life to start building. The hard part was over. I'd taken action. Now I just had to follow through. The next day, Sunday, May 19th. I woke up in the guest bedroom where I'd moved my things the previous afternoon. Martin hadn't come home Saturday night. I'd received a text from him around 11 p.m. saying he was staying at a hotel, that he needed time to think, that we'd talk soon. I didn't respond. I spent the morning preparing for the dinner with my daughters. I cooked Rebecca's favorite meal, chicken parmesan with homemade pasta sauce and garlic bread. I made Sarah's favorite dessert, a chocolate cream pie. I wanted the house to smell like home, wanted them to feel comfortable and safe, because what I was about to tell them would shake the foundation of everything they thought they knew about our family. Rebecca arrived first at 4:30, coming straight from Des Moines, where she lived with her boyfriend Jake. She walked in and immediately knew something was wrong. Maybe it was my face. Maybe it was the absence of Martin's car in the driveway. Maybe it was just that maternal intuition mothers sometimes pass down to daughters. She hugged me tight and asked if I was okay. I told her we'd wait for Sarah, that I needed to tell them both something important. Rebecca's face went pale. She asked if I was sick, if something was wrong with her dad. I assured her everyone was healthy, we just needed to talk. Sarah arrived at 5, fresh from her salon, which had been surprisingly busy for a Sunday morning. She came in chattering about a particularly difficult color correction she'd done, but stopped mid-sentence when she saw Rebecca and me sitting at the kitchen table. No food on the table yet, both of us looking serious. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately. "Where's Dad?" I gestured for her to sit down. Then I took a deep breath and told them everything. I started at the beginning, finding the box in the attic in September 2023. I told them about the documents, the bank accounts, the cabin in Decorah I'd never known existed. I told them about the photos, about 20 years of betrayal, about how their father and their Aunt Diane had been having an affair since 2003, since before Sarah had even graduated high school. I watched their faces as I talked, watched denial turn to confusion, turn to shock, turn to horror. Rebecca kept shaking her head, saying no over and over, as if refusing to believe it would make it not true. Sarah just sat there frozen, her face blank, tears streaming down her cheeks. When I'd finished the basic facts, I pulled out the photo, the one from 2015 with Martin and Diane at the cabin in their pajamas. I slid it across the table. Both girls looked at it. Sarah made a sound like she'd been punched. Rebecca pushed the photo away like it burned her fingers. "I don't understand," Rebecca said, her voice shaking. "Aunt Diane, really? She's family. She's been at every birthday, every Christmas, I don't understand." "I didn't either," I said. "For 20 years I didn't understand why your father seemed distant, why certain things didn't add up, why I felt like something was wrong even when I couldn't name what it was. Now I understand. He was living a double life, and Diane helped him do it while pretending to be my family, my friend, someone I could trust." "Does she know?" Sarah asked. "Does Aunt Diane know you found out?" "She will soon. Your father went to her yesterday after he was served with the divorce papers. I imagine they're together now, trying to figure out how to handle this." "Divorce?" Rebecca looked stricken. "Mom, wait, can't you guys try counseling or something? 40 years of marriage?" 20 of those years were a lie, sweetheart. I can't stay married to someone who's been deceiving me since you were in college. I can't pretend this is something I can just forgive and move past. And honestly, even if I could forgive it, I don't want to. Your father made his choice. He chose Diane. He's been choosing her for 2 decades. Now he gets to have her, publicly, without me standing in the way. And I get to finally have a life that's based on truth instead of lies. We talked for hours. I showed them copies of the bank statements, the property records, the receipts and credit card statements that proved the affair had been going on for years. They asked questions. They cried. They got angry. Rebecca wanted to call her father immediately and confront him. Sarah wanted to go to Diane's house and scream at her. I told them they could do both of those things if they wanted to. but that they might want to wait until they'd processed their feelings a bit more, until they knew what they wanted to say. I also gave them the letters I'd written, one for each of them. I told them to read them later, when they were alone, when they had time to really think about everything. I told them that their relationship with their father was separate from my relationship with him, that I wasn't asking them to choose sides or cut him out of their lives, but that I needed them to know the truth about what had happened and why I was making the choices I was making. Around 9 p.m., after we'd finally eaten dinner, though none of us had much appetite, Rebecca asked me what I was going to do now, where I was going to live, how I was going to handle the divorce, what my plans were for the future. I told her honestly that I wasn't entirely sure yet. The house would probably have to be sold and the proceeds divided. I'd continue teaching for now. I had 2 more years until retirement, and having the structure and income of my job felt important. I'd probably get an apartment somewhere in Cedar Rapids, something small and manageable just for me. I might travel a bit once the divorce was final. I'd never been to Europe, had always wanted to go, but Martin claimed we couldn't afford it. Now I knew that we couldn't afford it, because he was spending money on a secret cabin and secret accounts for his secret life with Diane. I'm 66 years old, I told my daughters. I don't know how much time I have left. Could be 5 years, could be 30. But however much time I have, I want to spend it living authentically, surrounded by people who actually love me, doing things that bring me joy instead of just going through the motions of a life that was based on lies. I deserve that. I deserve to know what it's like to live without constantly doubting my own perception, without walking on eggshells, without the background hum of wrongness that I've felt for 20 years. Both girls hugged me before they left. They promised to call me tomorrow, to check in regularly, to be there for whatever I needed. Rebecca said something that made me cry. She said that she'd always thought our family was boring but solid, and learning that the boring part was real, but the solid part was an illusion, was like finding out the ground under her feet had never really been there at all. She said she was sorry I'd had to deal with this alone for so long, sorry she hadn't seen it, sorry she couldn't protect me from it. I told her I was sorry too. Sorry that they had to learn their father was capable of such sustained deception. Sorry that their aunt had betrayed us all. Sorry that their childhood memories of family gatherings and holidays were now tainted with this knowledge. But I also told them that we'd get through it, that we'd build new memories based on truth and trust, that this ending was also a beginning. After they left, I cleaned up the kitchen, put away the leftover food, washed the dishes. Then I sat down at the computer and started writing emails. To my close friends from church, to Martin's siblings, to my surviving aunts and uncles, to Diane's mother, my mother's sister, who deserved to know what her daughter had done. I didn't write these emails out of vindictiveness, but out of a need for truth-telling. These people had been part of my life for decades. They'd celebrated with Martin and me, had supported us through hard times, had witnessed what they thought was a strong, stable marriage. They deserved to know that what they'd been witnessing was a performance, not reality. They deserved to know why I was getting divorced after 40 years, why I wouldn't be at family gatherings with Martin anymore, why Diane was no longer welcome in my life. I was honest in these emails without being cruel. I laid out the facts, the affair, the duration, the secret assets, the systematic deception. I didn't embellish or exaggerate. I didn't need to. The truth was damaging enough on its own. By the time I finished writing and sending all the emails, it was after midnight. I was exhausted, but also energized in a strange way. Everything was out in the open now. No more secrets, no more pretending, no more protecting Martin and Diane from the consequences of their choices. Tomorrow, everyone would know. And I could finally start moving forward. I went to bed in the guest room, and for the first time in months, I slept straight through the night without waking up. Orchestrated narrative structure and calibrated word distribution across sections. I'm making good progress. Let me check my word counts so far. Sections 1-5 are complete and should total around 11, 12. 500 words. I'm now starting section 6. resolution planning, which needs 4,004, 500 words. Then Section 7, execution, needs 3,504,000 words. Section 8, consequences, needs 2,503,000 words. Section 9, closing, needs 1,001, 300 words. I need to continue developing the story fully to reach 18,020,000 words. Let me continue with Section 6, which should be very detailed about how Vera planned her post-divorce life, dealt with the fallout, built her new life, and the various strategic and practical preparations she made. The week following my revelation to the girls and my emails to family and friends was a whirlwind of reactions, phone calls, and consequences that unfolded exactly as I'd anticipated, and in some ways I hadn't expected. Monday morning, I woke to 17 voicemail messages and 43 text messages. Some were from family members expressing shock and offering support. Some were from friends saying they couldn't believe it, that they were so sorry, that they were there for me if I needed anything. A few, very few, suggested that maybe I was overreacting, that perhaps there was some misunderstanding, that 40 years of marriage was worth fighting for even in the face of betrayal. I deleted those messages without responding. Anyone who could witness this level of deception and think I should just work it out wasn't someone whose opinion I valued. My phone rang at 7 a.m. It was Diane's mother, my Aunt Patricia. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept saying she was sorry, that she couldn't believe her daughter would do something like this, that she'd raised Diane better than that. She asked if there was anything she could do, any way to make it right. I told her gently that there wasn't, that this wasn't her responsibility or her shame to carry, that I knew she'd done her best as a mother and that Diane's choices were Diane's alone. Later that day, I got a call from Diane herself. I let it go to voicemail. She called 3 more times. Each time, I let it go to voicemail. Finally, around 7 p.m., I listened to the messages. In the first one, she was crying, saying we needed to talk, that she could explain, that things weren't how they seemed. In the second, she was angry, accusing me of trying to destroy her life, of being vindictive, of not understanding the situation. By the third message, she sounded defeated, almost hollow. She said she was sorry, that she'd never meant for things to go this far, that she'd loved me too, in her own way, even while betraying me. That last part made me laugh bitterly. What kind of love conducts a 20-year affair with your cousin's husband? I never called her back. I had nothing to say to her. No explanation she could offer would change what she'd done. No apology would undo 20 years of systematic betrayal. She was dead to me now. Not because I hated her, hate requires too much energy, but because she simply didn't matter anymore. She was irrelevant to my life going forward. Martin tried to come home on Tuesday. I'd had the locks changed on Monday afternoon. Sandra had suggested this as a practical measure since technically the house was marital property, and I couldn't legally keep him out permanently. But changing the locks would at least give me control over when and how he entered. When he showed up Tuesday evening and discovered his key didn't work, he knocked. I didn't answer. He called my phone. I didn't answer. He sent text messages saying we needed to talk, that he deserved a chance to explain. I texted back once, "Talk to your lawyer. Mine will be in touch about property division and settlement terms." I felt the girls needed to manage their own relationships with their father, so I encouraged them to meet with him if they wanted to have the conversations they needed to have. Rebecca took him to coffee a week later. She told me afterward that he'd cried through the entire meeting, that he'd said he still loved me, that the affair with Diane was complicated, that he never meant to hurt anyone. Rebecca said she told him that whatever his intentions were, the impact was devastating, and that he'd destroyed her faith in relationships, in family, in everything she'd thought was solid and real. She said she needed time to process everything and couldn't commit to regular contact with him until she'd worked through her feelings. Sarah refused to see Martin at all for the first month. She was angrier than Rebecca, more vocal about her hurt and betrayal. She'd always been a daddy's girl growing up, and I think the betrayal cut her especially deep. When he finally convinced her to meet him 6 weeks after everything came out, she told him he'd ruined her image of what love and marriage were supposed to be, that she didn't know if she could ever trust a partner after watching him deceive me for 20 years. She said he'd broken something in her and she didn't know if it could be fixed. Meanwhile, the divorce proceedings moved forward. Sandra was brilliant, aggressive but professional, thorough in her documentation of Martin's financial deception. She subpoenaed bank records that revealed even more than I'd found in the attic box. There were additional credit cards I hadn't known about. There were investment accounts he'd hidden. The cabin in Decorah was valued during the proceedings, and it turned out to be worth even more than the earlier appraisal I'd found. Current market value was $310,000. Iowa's no-fault divorce law meant that the affair itself wasn't the legal issue. The hidden assets were. Sandra argued successfully that Martin had dissipated marital assets by using joint funds to maintain his relationship with Diane and to acquire property he'd hidden from me. The judge agreed. Not only would I receive half of everything we'd acquired during our marriage, but I was also awarded a larger share of some assets to compensate for Martin's misuse of marital funds over the years. The final settlement, reached in October 2024 after months of negotiations, gave me the house outright with Martin responsible for paying off the remaining mortgage. I also received 60% of Martin's retirement account, half the value of the Decorah cabin, which Martin would have to either sell or buy me out of, half of the secret Wells Fargo account, and alimony for 5 years. Sandra estimated that between the property settlement and alimony, I'd receive approximately $450,000 over the next 5 years, plus full ownership of a house that was worth about $350,000 once the mortgage was paid off. I didn't want any of this for the money itself. I would have been perfectly happy with a simple 50-50 split. But the enhanced settlement felt like acknowledgement from the legal system that what Martin had done was wrong, that systematically lying and hiding assets from your spouse for 20 years has consequences beyond just dividing property equally. It felt like justice. The church community's reaction was mixed, which I'd expected. Some people were incredibly supportive, bringing meals, calling to check on me, inviting me to join various social groups so I wouldn't be isolated. But there was also gossip, speculation, people taking sides. A few members of our congregation seemed to believe that a wife should forgive any transgression, that divorce was always wrong regardless of circumstances. One woman actually told me that I was breaking my marriage vows and defying God's plan by divorcing Martin. I looked her in the eye and told her that Martin had broken our marriage vows 20 years ago, repeatedly and deliberately, and that if God expected me to stay in a marriage built on decades of lies, then perhaps I needed to find a different church. I did leave that congregation, ultimately. Not out of spite, but because I realized I needed a fresh start somewhere that didn't have 40 years of memories attached to it. Somewhere I could just be Vera, rather than being Martin's wife, or that poor woman whose husband cheated with her cousin. I started attending a smaller church on the other side of town, and I found a community there that was warm and accepting and asked no questions about my past. Lorraine, my friend who I'd confided in early on, remained a steady source of support throughout everything. She'd check in on me regularly, invite me over for dinner with her and her husband Tom, include me in activities with their church group. She never said, "I told you so," about having suspected something years earlier. She just showed up for me, consistently, proving that real friendship exists and that not everyone in the world is a liar. During this time, I also started therapy. Sandra had suggested it, and I'd resisted at first. I wasn't the one who needed therapy. Martin and Diane were the ones who'd done something wrong. But Sandra explained that therapy wasn't about fixing what was broken in me. It was about processing what had been done to me, about learning to trust my own judgment again, about building healthy patterns for the future. She gave me the name of a therapist who specialized in betrayal trauma and rebuilding after infidelity. Dr. Ellen Morrison, no relation to my maiden name, just one of those coincidences, turned out to be exactly what I needed. She was in her 50s, warm but direct, and she had a way of asking questions that made me really think about things I'd been avoiding. We talked about how I'd learned as a teenager, after my brother's death, to suppress my own needs and perceptions in order to keep the peace. We talked about how that pattern had made me vulnerable to Martin's gaslighting, how I'd been primed to doubt myself rather than trust my instincts. We talked about the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, about how I could release the anger without ever speaking to Martin or Diane again. One of the most valuable things Dr. Morrison helped me understand was that my grief was multi-layered. I wasn't just grieving the end of my marriage, I was grieving the marriage I'd thought I had, the man I'd thought Martin was, the cousin I'd thought Diane was, the family I'd thought we were. I was grieving 40 years of false memories. Every holiday and birthday, an ordinary Tuesday that I'd thought meant something, but that had existed in the context of massive deception. I was grieving my own naivety, my lost time, my stolen peace of mind. All of those griefs were legitimate, and all of them needed to be processed. By early 2025, I was starting to feel like myself again, or maybe like a new version of myself. Someone stronger, more self-assured, less willing to doubt her own perception. Someone who'd survived something terrible and come out the other side intact. I'd lost weight without trying, just from the stress of everything, but I was sleeping better. The tension headaches that had plagued me for years had disappeared. I was teaching with renewed energy, finding joy in my students that felt pure and uncomplicated. I also started making plans for my post-retirement life. I had 2 years left until I could retire from teaching at 68 with full benefits. Once I retired, with my pension, Social Security, and the alimony from Martin, I'd have a comfortable income. The house would be paid off by then. I started researching places I'd always wanted to visit but never had. Ireland, Scotland, the Pacific Northwest, New England in the fall. I joined a book club with other women from my new church. I started taking a painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but never made time for. In March 2025, the house sold for $375,000. After paying off the mortgage and closing costs, I walked away with approximately $320,000 in cash. I put most of it in a mixture of investments and savings, keeping enough readily available to pay for retirement plans and any emergencies. For the first time in my life, I had real financial security that was completely under my control, with no one lying to me about where money was going or what we could or couldn't afford. I bought a small 2-bedroom condo in a quiet neighborhood in Cedar Rapids. It had big windows, a small balcony with a view of a park, and enough space for me, but not so much that I felt rattled around in emptiness. It was mine, truly mine. Every piece of furniture I bought for it, I chose myself. Every paint color, every decoration, every practical decision was made by me alone, based on my preferences, my needs, my vision for how I wanted to live. The girls helped me move in. Both of them had processed their feelings about the divorce enough to be present and supportive, though I knew they were still working through complicated feelings about their father. Rebecca had started her own therapy to deal with trust issues that had cropped up in her relationship with Jake. Sarah had briefly broken up with her longtime boyfriend because she was suddenly terrified of being betrayed like I'd been. Though they'd gotten back together after a few weeks, once she realized she was projecting my experience onto her own relationship. One Saturday in April, as we were hanging curtains in my new living room, Sarah asked me something I'd been waiting for one of them to ask. "Mom, are you happy?" I stopped what I was doing and really thought about the question. Was I happy? Not happy like joyful, not happy like life was perfect, but happy in the deeper sense. Was I at peace? Did I feel like myself? Was I building a life I actually wanted to live? Yeah, I told her honestly. I actually am. Not every minute of every day, and I still have moments where I'm angry about the time I lost and the lies I believed. But overall, I'm happier than I was for the entire 20 years I was living in that fog of wrongness without knowing why. I'm free now. Free to be honest, free to trust my own judgment, free to build a life that's real instead of one that's built on someone else's lies. So yes, sweetheart, I'm happy. Maybe truly happy for the first time in decades. By now, I know you're invested in this story, in this journey from betrayal to freedom. If you've stuck with me this far, hearing about the darkest period of my life and how I found my way through it, then you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Before I tell you about what happened next, about the final confrontations, the ultimate consequences for Martin and Diane, and how I've rebuilt my life in ways I never imagined, please take just a moment to like this video if you haven't already. Your support literally takes 1 second, but it helps this story reach other women who might be living in that same fog I was in, who might be doubting their own instincts, who need to hear that it's never too late to choose yourself and your truth. Drop a comment telling me what you think, or what city you're watching from. I genuinely love connecting with all of you and hearing how these stories resonate with people around the world. These small actions make such a huge difference in helping this channel grow and reach more people who need these messages. Thank you so much for being here with me. The official divorce was finalized in November 2024, almost exactly a year after I'd discovered the truth. Martin and I had to appear in court together one final time for the judge to sign off on our settlement agreement. It was the first time I'd seen him in person since that Saturday morning when he'd been served with the papers. He looked terrible. He'd lost weight, aged visibly, developed deep lines around his eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. Part of me felt satisfaction at seeing the toll this had taken on him, but mostly I just felt nothing. He was a stranger to me now, someone I'd once known but no longer had any connection to. Our lawyers did most of the talking. The judge reviewed the settlement terms, confirmed that both parties agreed to all provisions, and signed the papers. Just like that, 40 years of marriage were officially over. We were no longer husband and wife. We were two separate people who'd once shared a life, but now shared nothing except 2 adult daughters and a complicated history. As we left the courtroom, Martin tried to talk to me. He called my name. I kept walking. He called again. I stopped and turned, one hand on the courthouse door. What, Martin? I wanted to say I'm sorry for all of it. I know you don't want to hear it, but I needed to say it. I'm sorry. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the things I could say, all the ways I could respond to his apology. I could tell him his apology was 20 years too late. I could tell him that sorry doesn't undo decades of lies. I could tell him what his betrayal had cost me, how it had affected our daughters, how it had rippled through our entire family and community. I could tell him that I hoped he and Diane were happy together now that they could be public, though I doubted they would be, since relationships built on lies and secrecy rarely survive in the light of day. But I didn't say any of those things. Instead, I just looked at him with complete calm and said, I know you are, but that doesn't change anything. Goodbye, Martin. And I walked out of that courthouse and never looked back. I later learned through the girls that Martin and Diane did try to make a go of it after the divorce. Without the secrecy, without the excitement of the affair, their relationship apparently lost its appeal pretty quickly. They moved in together at the Decker cabin, which Martin kept in the settlement after buying out my share, and lasted about 4 months before Diane moved out. Turns out that sneaking around and having a forbidden romance is very different from being an ordinary couple with all the mundane realities of daily life. They broke up officially in March 2025, about 4 months after my divorce was final. Rebecca told me that Martin had tried to reach out to Diane multiple times after the breakup, but she'd blocked his number and told him she never wanted to see him again. There was a bitter irony in that. Martin had sacrificed 40 years of marriage, his relationship with his daughters, his reputation in the community, and most of his assets, all for a relationship with Diane that didn't even survive 6 months, once it had to exist in reality rather than in secret. Diane's life had apparently fallen apart in other ways too. News of the affair had spread through our extended family and her workplace. Several family members cut off contact with her entirely. Her mother was devastated, and their relationship was severely strained. At work, while she couldn't be fired for personal behavior, she found herself increasingly isolated as colleagues who'd once been friendly became coldly professional or avoided her altogether. She'd eventually requested a transfer to a different hospital in Iowa City, about 30 minutes away, just to escape the judgment and gossip. I can't say I felt bad for her. She'd made her choices, just like Martin had. She'd known exactly what she was doing when she carried on with my husband for 20 years while pretending to be my friend and family. She'd known the damage it would cause if it came out. She'd just believed we'd never find out, that she could have her cake and eat it too indefinitely. Now she was living with the consequences of that decision, and frankly, she deserved every bit of discomfort she was experiencing. As for me, I was thriving in ways I hadn't anticipated. My new condo felt like a sanctuary. I decorated it with things I loved: bright colors, comfortable furniture, artwork I'd picked out myself from local artists. I had a little balcony where I drank my morning coffee and watched the sunrise. I had space that was entirely mine, where no one was lying to me, where I didn't have to question what was real and what was performance. I'd continued with my therapy sessions with Dr. Morrison, now on a less frequent basis, but still regularly. We'd been working on something she called reclaiming my narrative, which meant consciously rewriting the story of my life to focus not on what had been done to me, but on how I'd responded, survived, and ultimately prevailed. I wasn't poor Vera whose husband cheated on her. I was Vera who'd discovered a massive betrayal, gathered evidence methodically, executed a strategic plan, and then rebuilt her entire life at 66 years old. That was a story of strength, not victimhood. In May 2025, 6 months after my divorce was final, I did something I'd never done before. I took a solo vacation. Not a quick weekend trip, but a full 2-week vacation to Ireland, something I'd always wanted to do but that Martin had always found reasons to avoid. I stayed in small bed and breakfasts, drove on the wrong side of the road through countryside that looked like something from a fairy tale, visited ancient castles, and drank Guinness in cozy pubs where I chatted with locals and other travelers. I hiked along the cliffs of Moher, explored the streets of Dublin, and stood in the rain on the west coast looking out at the Atlantic Ocean. And I felt free. Completely, entirely free in a way I hadn't felt since I was a young woman. Before marriage and responsibilities, and the slow erosion of self that happens when you spend decades trusting someone who doesn't deserve it. I was 67 years old, and I was standing on a cliff in Ireland, alone, but not lonely, independent and strong, and I realized that this was what I'd been fighting for all along. Not revenge against Martin and Diane, though there was some satisfaction in that. Not just financial security or legal justice. I'd been fighting for this, for the right to stand somewhere beautiful and know that I was living my real life, my honest life, my chosen life. I took hundreds of photos on that trip, but my favorite was one astran.